Welcome everyone again to another episode of the IdeaXme show, that show that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world and inspiring the future and future creators. For all those that like really great stories, I'm Ira Pastor, your health and life sciences ambassador along for the journey. So the term precision medicine typically refers to the tailoring of medical treatments to individual characteristics of a patient, and sort of away from this one-size-fits-all model that has been quite predominant over the last century or so. Ultimately, with the ability to classify individuals into different subpopulations that can highlight their susceptibility to a particular disease, to the prognosis of a disease, and ultimately responds to certain treatments. And then preventative or therapeutic interventions can ultimately be tailored, concentrated on those that are going to benefit, and away from those that won't benefit or potentially will have side effects, sparing a lot of expense along the way. Ultimately, to make precision medicine a reality requires an extremely large amount and a very diverse amount of data, and ultimately the ability to pull actionable information from that data. The All of Us research program, which was previously known as the Precision Medicine Initiative Cohort Program, is a research program that's run by the United States National Institutes of Health. It was created back in 2015 during the presidency of Barack Obama, originally funded to around $130 million, ultimately to take advantage of the advances in tailoring medical care to an individual. The mission of the All of Us program is to accelerate health and medical breakthroughs, enabling individualized patient prevention, treatment, and care. The project aims to collect genetic, lifestyle, environmental, and metabolomic data from over 1 million volunteers over the lifespan of these volunteers to ultimately accelerate research and improve health outcomes. And this data concludes, but is by no means limited to information about personal lifestyle and environment, electronic health records, biosamples, physical measurements, data gathered through wearables like Fitbits, clinical trial data, and so forth. Today, we are honored to be joined by Chris Lunt. Chris is a veteran technology executive with experience in both Silicon Valley and the federal government, and he currently serves as Chief Technology Officer at the National Institutes of Health All of Us Research Program. In his Chief Technology Officer role, Chris leads the efforts to build an engagement and digital data platform that's intended to be used by thousands of folks to perform studies on this data. He creates partnerships with various nationwide organizations to help develop the technologies that help securely gather this information and integrate the data for broad research use, and ultimately develop analytical approaches and visualization methods to allow researchers of many types to explore and understand this wide data set. Chris joined the NIH from Get Insured, where he served as the Vice President of Government Solutions. He worked with the federal government, states, and vendor community to improve health insurance and shopping and enrollment systems at the time. Previously, he worked at Health and Human Services Entrepreneur. He also served as the Vice President of Engineering at ReadyForce, the Chief Executive Officer of Nombre, the founder and Vice President of Engineering at Wisdom Arc, and the Senior Director of Engineering at Friendster. All that being said, Chris, thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to come on the show today and talk to us a little while.
I'm excited to be here.
Thanks so much. It's really exciting on our end. Typically on the show, we start off by giving our guests the floor for a little bit, just to introduce themselves, talk about themselves for a little bit. If you can sort of tell us where you grew up, how you developed an interest in information systems, computer sciences, and a little bit of your journey through the world of both infotech as well as health tech. So sort of taking us up to that point where you are really sort of at the forefront of this, what I'll call this mega project that merges the two together.
You look at your own career and you look at your own life, and often there's things that are only obvious in retrospect, that the themes and the threads that sort of allowed one experience to lead into the next isn't obvious when you're going through it. You're operating on some instinct, some deeper part of your personality. And people look at it from the outside and go like, well, why did you do that? That didn't make any sense, where somehow internally it makes sense. And it's only after you get a little time and you can look back and you start to line up and see like, oh, this is the thing all these things have in common. For me, I think my interest in digital identity is one of these themes that shows up throughout this experience. by virtue of having had the privilege of being there when the web was first really starting to come
Mm-hmm.
together. And I was at Excite, which was one of the first internet portals. And I built a lot of their systems for managing the data that we were sharing at that time. And it was a remarkable crucible to stand in front of when we were just starting to forge this whole new way that people were going to interact. And you look at all the communities that came together around that, or all the identities before where people felt really splintered. For the first time, we're able to see there are people like me, and they're able to create that. And there's positive and negatives to that, I think, as we've seen, right? But I
Sure.
certainly look at a lot of the positives of all of the artistic communities and the craft communities. Now, like all the things that you can go on YouTube and these sort of lost or dying arts that are now coming back. That's really exciting
Absolutely.
to see. But part of that was also understanding, how do you build a digital identity? How do you build trust in this environment? And that shows up in terms of my work with the social networking work that I did. That shows up in terms of the work that I'm doing now for the government, where a large part of what this program, the All of Us program, is about, um, includes understanding, what is the data footprint that a person leaves out there,
Mm-hmm.
and what can we access in a way that's ethical and that's well consented to bring together to help inform our understanding of health in all of its forms, right? I think people tend to think of health very much as a wet science still,
Mm-hmm.
but right,
Mm-hmm.
the other aspect of that, the psychological aspect, I think we're just starting to tap into. I have a friend who's a doctor over at Stanford who
Mm-hmm.
has a project where you install an app on your phone and it takes a snapshot of the screen like once a minute, or maybe even a little more frequently than that. And then looking over time at your own usage, your own interaction with that digital world and the information you're exposed to and how that forms your identity and how you interact with your society are things that are really fascinating to me. Obviously constrained on all sides, right? In terms
Mm-hmm.
of, having to work with our institutional review board and sort of doing everything in an ethical way and doing everything in a consented way. But we're really, I think, on the cusp of this new understanding of identity and also human intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
and how we can find new ways to interact to really improve the experience of being a human being, and what we're capable of doing, and how much we sort of can extend our will out into the universe to create beauty and to create environments where we can sort of live together in a way that makes all of us feel really fulfilled.
Very elegant. Very
A
elegant.
little grandiose, but yes.
No, no, I very much appreciate that vision, and it's it makes me think of all the disciplines that really need to come together to make something like this reality. As you're saying, this is more than just like it's more than STEM. I mean, there's a lot more to sort of understanding the human situation in creating something that this all encompassing.
I
Um,
do. I want to go back to it because I didn't fully address your question, I think, too, which was
no, go ahead,
I left myself out of it a little bit,
please.
and maybe I'll just put a little bit of myself in it.
Sure.
That I think that I was friends with my great great uncle George.
Uh-huh.
He lived to be 100 years old. He
Mm-hmm.
died in 2000, and that my family generations back had homesteaded some property in northern Michigan that he'd lived on, and I've spent time on it. It's the property's still in the family, and I remember spending time there with my great great uncle Eli, who still lived there as a small dairy farm, effectively, and spending time with great great uncle George. He had been born in a world where, in this house, there was no electricity, and there was a pump in the kitchen, and there
Mm-hmm.
was an outhouse, and he rode horses, and in his lifetime, right, he saw electrification, household appliances, refrigeration, the automobile, air travel, uh, computers, space flight, like he lived in a medieval world almost, and by the time he passed away, he lived in this future that was almost
Mm-hmm.
unimaginable. And I remember being 15 years old and thinking, like, is this going to happen to me?
Mm-hmm.
And that first moment was probably, it's either like 95, I think it's the first time that I understood what was going on in the internet, and not just sort of like, oh, it's the way moving files around, which is the way I'd thought about it before, but like, no, this changed the way what it means to be a human. Or also looking at mobile phones, and for the first time thinking, like, this actually changes a lot. And especially to sort of think ahead to ubiquitous computing, where like I'm always walking around with the world's knowledge in my pocket. And then what GPS did, and there was moments where I was like, oh my God, it is going to happen to me. Like, in 20 years from now, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to be different to be a human. But maybe I can dedicate myself to being a midwife to history. Like, I can go and
Mm-hmm.
find the places where this is the front edge of where this is happening. Can I learn things that can help us to make that transition in a way that allows us to preserve the things that make us human and that matter to us, but help us carry that forward into a new milieu, and hopefully a new and better way of being. And I feel like I've gotten to do that, right? I got to be there at the start of the internet. I
Sure.
got to be there at the start of social networking, although that thing's going a little sideways in my opinion. And now I feel like I have a chance here to be at this place where we're reinventing research. We're reinventing the way that we think about using data to ask questions and to get answers that are important to us.
Outstanding. Outstanding. Could you, before we get into some of the different components of the program, could you take a little bit of time to talk about the general setup of this? Before we started the show, you mentioned that you were out in Mountain View in sort of the heart of Silicon Valley, but this is obviously an NIH run initiative. And when you go into the program website, you talk about a variety of the different partners that it has. You have genomics partners at the Hudson Alpha Institute and Baylor and the Broad Institute. Scripps is doing things with regard to the participant component of this. Mayo Clinic with biobanking. Could you talk a little bit about, I think of NIH, in my past, just taking a train out of Philly down to Bethesda. Give us a little structure to this, sort of
Sure.
where all of us are. Where's Ron, your budget, sort of the staff that's involved with overseeing this. Take us through that if you would.
Yeah, and I think, well, of course, what the interesting problem there is that a lot of this we had to invent as we went, right? I think we had a great vision that really started with Dr. Collins, who runs the NIH now, right?
Sure.
And back in 2000 or 2002, they finished sequencing the human genome for the first time, and he's the head of National Human Genomics Research Institute, NHGRI at the time. And he sort of sees this possibility of like, this data can change everything of our understanding of human health. And we've got this book now in front of us that lays everything out. And we have no idea how to read the book. And the only way we're going to figure out how to read the book is to be able to start to correlate, like when I see this phrase in the book, this is what it means in terms of experienced human health. But to do that, I need to collect a lot of information about experienced human health. Yep. And so the idea for this program for him started back then. He even wrote a big paper back then that I think sort of laid that vision out for the first time. In 2015, right, he finally gets the buy-in from everybody. Yes, we're going to fund this, we're going to make this possible. And by then, it wasn't just genomics anymore, right? Between genomics and then 2015, we realized like, we've got a bunch of other new instruments that are producing incredible information that's not entirely clear what they are telling us. And take like metabolomics. Like if you look at all of the small molecules that are, swimming around in your body, and I don't, this number is not so up to date, but like last time I feel like I'd looked, like 80% of what's in there, we don't know what it does.
Sure.
Like we don't know if it's a pollutant. It's just something in the environment, it's in your blood. It's harmful. It's not harmful. It's a byproduct of a healthy process, of a disease process. And the only way we're going to figure that out to a degree is to then be able to start to go, well, okay, I got a guy and like he didn't have this condition and this thing wasn't in his blood. Now he's this condition, this thing is in his blood. And that's how we're going to start to figure out a lot of this. And so that the Precision Medicine Initiative was the idea in part of, it's not just genomics, but right, what are all the kinds of data that we can bring in here, bring together into one place so you can start to see, oh, when this is high, and there's some relationship between them. And then we'll get you to the end, right? Then you'll actually need to go to like, well, I'm going to have to go to an animal model or a, some sort of simulation or something to figure out the actual metabolomic process that creates that. But it'll be a tremendous way to get pointers out into the places where we should be looking. The way that when the program started with such a grand vision of 1 million people that we're bringing in and those people being diverse and underrepresented, and that needs to be then put onto a platform that there's better access than's ever been provided before, we were going to do that alone. And the NIH, of course, traditionally it's a grant organization, right? Like we give money away to make all these things happen. Sure. But a sense of like, it was going to be too broad of a consortium to do that. We're just sort of like, and now you guys go figure it out, right? It was going to take some vision and some leadership there centrally as a coordinating center too. And so we broke the problem down into 6 major areas, and you touched on them pretty much, right? Is we needed partners to help us interact with participants. We need partners to help us interact with researchers. We needed partners to help us to collect the electronic health records and do the interaction of collecting biosamples and all of that. And we needed to do that both in the traditional NIH way of like, we're going to have a bunch of hospitals, academic medical centers, things we'll work with. And we're trying to do a new way, we'll do a direct volunteer program where you can come here, you're not part of a hospital, just come sign up, and then we're going to figure out how to get your biosamples. We're going to mail you a saliva tube, or we're going to mail you a blood kit that you take to your local Quest and they use to pull the blood or whatever. And then we need someone to do all the genomics. Oh, and then we need all the community partners. Like the fact is, like, if you're going to go out, if you go to an African American community, we're like, hey, we'd like you to be part of a medical study. Henrietta Lacks and the Tuskegee Airmen are in the room with you. Like, everyone knows these stories, right? And that there's a deficit of trust that you've got to get past. And that the best way to do that is to not just go individually win people over, but to engage with the broader community and to find the leadership in that community and convince them, right? No, this is an approach of, like, we're really trying to bring health to everybody. And we're trying to make sure that everybody gets a chance to be involved, and help them to then reach out to those communities and bring the participants in as well. And so then granting, and at this point, we have on the order of, I don't know, hundreds of awards, I think,
sure.
Just a lot of work, and we've learned too, right? I think we started in some cases with, this is how we're doing the awards. And we're like, oh, that didn't really work the way we'd hoped, right? And we're going to try and use new award vehicles. But then we also provide a lot of the guidance on top of, this is what the UX experience needs to be. This is what, this is what our expectations are about what controls we'll put in place for having access to the data, and then negotiating with all of our partners there. And so for me, just personally, I've never had a position with more soft power and less hard power. I'm used to running my own team. I hire everybody. I tell them what to do. It's command and control, more sort of structure. It's more collaborative than that, right? But now in a place of, like, I've got a consortium of organizations that's coming together, and we're meeting periodically, and I'm trying to give them enough guidance, structure, priorities, and things for them to be able to do the work, where I can't come in and tell you, like, oh, don't do this question or do this question in terms of the ethics training or something. Like, you have to be able to figure that out yourself. We can't do detail at that level. But you've got the chance to influence a tremendous amount of smart people then who are trying to make this vision reality.
In talking about sort of the sheer sort of amount of data, you've talked about electronic health records and wearables and mobile apps and so forth. And then, I read an interview that you gave a little while ago, and you made an interesting comment about the tremendous amount of dark matter related to our health that's out there. And you were referring to, in this particular interview, about the things that we don't typically see, in sort of in the medical record. You talk about mood, emotional state of a patient. These things that, normally, they're it's not like your blood pressure that's recorded in the chart as such. There could be other things. We did a show recently on sort of chronobiology, and how my blood pressure is slightly different in the morning as it is in the evening due to different factors. With your background in search engines and social media and things like this, talk about sort of somewhat what you envision in terms of capturing this dark matter and these other sort of less tangible components of health, and integrating them into the big mix.
Yeah, this is one of the interesting challenges for our program too, is that we are hypothesis neutral. So that's not to say that we don't have a set of priorities, but we're trying to make sure that we're not multiple myeloma registry, right? And that's our thing. And but that means without having those hypotheses up top, sometimes it's harder to prioritize work. And so we have a science committee, and that's a large part of our charge to them, is help us figure out, how can we make sure we're directing our efforts in a way that's crucial. And so they started with some, I think, good and obvious choices of, well, first off, what are the largest causes of mortality in the country? But also, what are the largest causes of morbidity? We don't want to ignore the fact that people live in pain for 20 years with arthritis. Just because they're still alive, that isn't enough. We want it to be more than that. And then using that, how can we prioritize the kinds of measures that we want to go for? And how can we, to your point, find measures in particular that bring along data that we don't know what it means?
Right.
It's one thing to go out and get step data and go well, there's a lot of people who've done work to sort of show that there's a correlation between how many steps you take a day and a lot of other aspects of your physical health. Could we get the raw accelerometry data? And so what else is in there potentially? Someone very slowly developing a tremor being a sign of some onset of a neurological disease. Looking at, and even for that matter, in some cases, even bolstering things that we do understand. So if you look at, for example, step data, The step data is notoriously bad for people who have any sort of mobility issues. So if you have a limp or something, then the step data generally, the algorithms that they use don't produce very good outcomes for that data. And so how can we get access to data that's more raw and put that in the hands of researchers as well, who may discover novel uses of it? Another story I tell about this that I find still very fascinating.
Sure.
There's work that it was Google or Verily did around doing detection of degenerative neuropathy, looking at retinal scans. So they were looking for a way to be able to do that automated, cheap, so you could go into a country like India, go to the countryside and sort of look for people who are developing blindness and catch it early enough. And some of that stuff has gotten very good. And along the way, it also found that like it could tell you the gender of the person by looking at their retina. And nobody went looking for that specifically. And nobody's exactly sure how it's telling that that's true, right? But that the machine learning algorithms were able to find, it's a good predictor of age. I can tell what gender this person is. And it makes you question, well, what else is in there? Like, and so if I could give you the entire electronic health record, like, are there other things that we could find that we don't even know that we could find from that data? Because, and that's of course the interesting long-term question here is how you can bring machine learning to bear on all of this. Because I mean, anything, all the machine learning algorithm is doing, which is pretty much all that any human researcher does, is you're looking for a pattern. And the fact is that, yeah, ultimately machines are going to get better at finding subtle patterns than humans are. Now they find a lot of false patterns for the same reason, which is one of the challenges doing all this work. But my long-term goal here too is to make sure that I'm ultimately creating a data set that's going to be of value for machine learning researchers too.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah, we talk about sort of the triad of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep learning a bit on the show, and sort of we're at an interesting point with regard to what's possible, what's still a dreaming. You've written a little bit about artificial intelligence also. Take us a little bit in terms of as a researcher now, how I should be, how I am capable of accessing this data today and to do some work. And then ultimately, if I make an interesting discovery in my lab that Asian Americans with a certain mutation do better on X blood pressure product than Y, how do I share that with everybody else in the system? What happens? You could walk through a little bit of that in terms of what I learn and how it's then it reinforces and helps out the rest of them.
And we've just launched our research workbench, the research platform, and we're in the beta period right now. And so we launched this in May, and during the beta, we are giving access to, and so in total, the program at this point has about 350,000 participants. And we've taken the electronic health record data for 225,000 of those people. And 75% of those people are from communities that are historically underrepresented in research, and more than 45% are from diverse races and ethnicities. We have included 6 initial surveys, which covers demographics, lifestyle factors, health, basic physical measurements, and then we also include basic physical measurements. So you have EHR, you have surveys, and you have some physical measurements. We have stripped that data both of identifiers and done some other work to protect the privacy of those individuals. We've put it onto a platform where you can do a basic cohort building exercise. You can pick, like, these are the people I want to look at. You can pick the data set that you want to look at. Out of that, I want to pull how many cigarettes they smoked, and I'm going to go pull the ICD-10 codes for everybody with any sort of lung issues. And then I can put that into a Jupyter notebook and I can work on it there. And so we're really at this point focusing at like informatics sort of scientists at that level. And we're going to be layering in more tools. And of course, the big thing everyone is excited about is when we add the genetics in. We're just about to start the sequencing. We're both doing some chip arrays, and we're doing whole genome sequencing. And we're going to be starting that process this year. And so next year, we anticipate being able to put the genomics in the platform, as well as the rest of the data, increase the total data set as we've continued to grow, and then provide access for a broader audience. And that's, right now we have a fairly strict set of controls over who gets access while we're in this beta, because we want to be very careful to make sure that we put the right data exfiltration protections
Sure.
in place and the right, re-identification protections in place. And so you have to be you have to be with a U.S. institution. The U.S. institution has to sign off on a data use agreement. You have to complete a responsible conduct of research training module. You have to sign a data use agreement personally, and you need to have an ERA Commons account. And so generally people who've worked with the NIH in the past will have an ERA Commons account. So that just sort of helps keep the audience a little smaller during the beta. And then we're looking at how we're getting out of the beta. And so this is the first phase, but at this point now, people can publish with this. So if you can find novel things in this, we don't have any sort of publication review board or anything. Like you're on your own to go do what you want. And also it's important to know about this platform.
Sure.
Although we require you to maintain an honest assessment of the work that you're doing in your workspace, and that is publicly shared, we do not adjudicate that.
Okay.
And so you are welcome to come in and work on your hypothesis, as long as it doesn't violate our data use agreement. And then go and publish. We ask for when you publish to inform us, so that we give the specific format we'd like for that, the credit to our program to also show up in terms of your publication. And then it goes out, into the world of publications, and it's up to that to sort of decide what's worthy of looking at or not. So we don't deal with the translational piece. So in terms of how that science actually gets turned into better clinical care is outside of the scope of our program.
Okay. You mentioned obviously the privacy issue. Clearly, it's become a big topic in sort of the social media realm, but always a major issue in healthcare. We're in a world of all sorts of interesting forms of cryptography nowadays, and obviously blockchain and all the stuff that's well beyond my scope. Can you just give us a little top line view on sort of the different privacy controls that you're developing to make people that are part of the million more comfortable in handing over this data versus not?
I think what's interesting too, and we're having a lot of conversations about this right now, relative to the coronavirus data that we've collected.
Sure.
So we also, starting back in, I guess, April, realized like we have to contribute to the broader effort to respond to the coronavirus crisis. And so what can we do that's, within our capability to do in alignment with our mission? So we're doing 3 different projects there. So one is we're doing an antibody testing study.
Okay.
Because we've been collecting blood samples,
Yep.
Every day, right up to the point where we shut down the program just for the safety of people not coming into the hospital, which happened in late March. And so we said, well, let's start with like the last 5,000 samples we pulled, do an antibody test on them and see if anybody had the disease previously. And if that number is high enough, we'll go back another 5,000 and keep going back in time, back through March, February, January. And, and if there's enough, then like, should we look in December? Should we look in November? Were there earlier cases of this than anyone had identified previously? The challenge there, as you can imagine, is getting a reliable antibody test. And so it's taken us a little while to both, get to the point where we had enough positive and negative samples that we were certain were positive and negative samples that we could use to send to a lab partner to test, and make sure that the false positive and false negative rates were going to be low enough that we felt like we could really proceed with that. And that's work we're doing right now. Additionally, we launched a survey that we've been doing monthly. So we've done it twice now. So we did it in May, we did it in June. That's a broad survey, takes on the order of 30 minutes, and asks questions related to your specific health, how you react to this. A lot of it's about your mood and mental health as well. And then finally, we also did some acceleration of our electronic health record collection for participants that we had, to go looking and seeing, were there people who had tested positive for the disease, how were they treated, how well did they recover, et cetera. And so what we're talking about right now is, how do we now release this data, and what are the privacy protections we need to put into place? As you can imagine, the challenge in the social media era is if somebody says, hey, I'm in the All of Us study, and I got diagnosed as corona positive or COVID positive on this day. It makes it really easy to find them in the data set if we include precise data. And so there's always an amount of blurring that we're looking at doing to the data to prevent people from being easily re-identified. And the problem with a lot of that blurring is if you blur too much, it reduces the utility of the data scientifically. And so, we can then sort of manage that by increasing the requirements we have in terms of the access controls, like how much are we going to vet you before we let you in to see the data. And so finding the balance point between those three things, between protecting the privacy of the individual participants, between providing more equitable access to this data set, and to preserving the scientific utility, is hard. And obviously, and there are very different camps on all of this too, right? Because the scientists are like, all the most precise data right now. And more of the equity advocates are like, we need to provide access to people that don't traditionally get access to this data. We don't want this to be like, oh, it's the same people the NIH always gives data to. We want to see a more diverse set of researchers as well. And so we're trying to find the right balance point on that. And that's a moving target, because a lot of the re-identification just gets harder and harder to prevent. As more and more data about people floods out there, there's more ways you can match against a data set that we have along, like their electronic health records.
Yep.
And or now including like wearables, because we have Fitbit data on people, we have Apple Watch data on people. And so now you're like, oh, like I ran the Boston Marathon. And now somebody goes and finds, well, let me just look and see, like when there's this huge spike in their activity levels that lines up with the Boston Marathon. And now I've narrowed down the audience, and I already narrowed them down by race and a couple other things. And now I can find the individual that I'm looking for. And so, yeah, it's hard and getting harder.
I can believe it. The National Research Council of the National Academy of Medicine defines what we've been talking about here in terms of precision medicine slightly different from personalized medicine, which brings in this component of treatments or preventions that may be targeted specifically for or developed for a specific individual. Now, I understand you're not in the drug development business today, but clearly there are implications here, because not just the sheer amount of data that you're capturing, but also sort of this the diversity of it. When you think about sort of drug development trials and so forth, how many people are usually excluded for one reason or another, which makes sort of the results that we get from clinical trials not perfect. What do you foresee in terms of something like the All of Us program down the line being useful, or sort of the application beyond sort of current medical care into sort of the future way we develop drugs?
And I'll even extend it beyond drugs too, just sort of into therapeutics more broadly. That
Sure.
if you look even with coronavirus right now, and you look at people who are the long haulers, people who end up with a cough for 60 days, a fever for 90 days, people who can't seem to quite break out of it. And you wonder about, like, is there something there that we could tell that ahead of time? Like, could I give you a risk profile?
Sure.
Before you even, and as you're considering your own behavior and how you react to this, like how willing are you to go out or interact with other people? And can you give me any way to understand from my own biology how I can modify my behavior? And that sort of then extending that into therapeutics, that, obviously sort of targeting, well, Vioxx. Do you remember Vioxx?
Absolutely.
Right. And like everyone was really excited about this drug, and then they had to pull it off really quickly. And like being able to stratify that would be incredibly valuable.
Absolutely.
And sort of just be able to identify, like, hey, you can take it, you can't.
Yep.
I feel like there's a lot of simple cases where we can even take, existing pharmaceuticals that have been developed in the past to go back and understand the variants that we see in the results. And some of that takes gathering, a set of dark matter, like a lot of novel data about people to understand. Like, is this due to genetics, epigenetics, to something environmental, to the memory of their immune system based on what they've been exposed to in the past?
Sure.
And some of those are places too where we talked before about how this is being made possible by advances in technology that let us collect data sets we didn't have before. And some of those are still really expensive, and some of them are kind of unreliable, but you can see those getting better year after year. And that's the thing, like with coronavirus, because the thing with looking at people's differing response to coronavirus and people who end up being sort of asymptomatic carriers, which puts me in mind of smallpox and cowpox.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
That, oh, well, like maybe there's, well, there are a lot of other coronaviruses out there. Like, which other ones had you already had before you had this? And how much does that affect your body's response to this? And so I would love to be able to see, based on all the antigens in my body, like, what have I had? As far as we can tell, at least, are like, well, these are the proteins you've encoded to look for that your immune system is going to react to. And that everybody should have an opportunity to almost know ahead of time, like, at any given point, what's your risk entering a particular area? That's one thing I said, and I think before we started, I'd mentioned, because you're in Philly, and I've looked up occasionally for different cities that the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences has produced a coronavirus risk score at the county level for the whole country, and they've visualized it in a way that's, I think, really great. And my wife and I did take a vacation where we drove up to the mountains, and we have a friend who has some property up there in the Sierras, and we camped on his property. We didn't see anybody. We were very responsible. But as we're going out, I'm thinking, okay, we're going to be passing through, like, Mariposa County. Could we stop at a restaurant while we're there? Could we go to the grocery store? And sort of me looking up, I don't know. Well, let's see what the risk score looks like for Mariposa County. I'm like, nope, it looks great, or it doesn't look so good. Like, and sort of adjusting our behavior appropriately. But it'd be interesting to be able to do all this too, knowing, like, what is my own risk on this? And so, yeah, I'd love to be able to a point where everybody gets, as part of their birthright as a human being, like, this is what your body plan is, in terms of, these are foods you should not be eating high fat foods. Like, some people, that's okay for you, it's not. Or specifically, you should be avoiding, lactose, or you should get your own instruction manual when you're born. Like, this is the body you've got. We'll fix the things we can, but you're going to want to, avoid coffee after noon. You're going to want to get 9 hours of sleep a night. There's a lot of things we could tell people right up front that could help them live a better life.
Moving a little bit away from NIH now, I want to sort of go back to the story you told at the beginning about the great Uncle George, I believe, two greats in there, and what it means to be human. Because obviously, your uncle saw a lot in the 20th century transitions. You were actively involved in IT, search engines, social media. Now, this mega project in the merging of information technology and healthcare, and there's a lot more going on. We did a show recently where we talked about so-called electroceuticals and the ability to sort of get a drug out of the way, and just a little zap from one computer to a wearable. You see where I'm going with this. I'm sure you sit around a lot of time you're spending thinking about the NIH and the All of Us project, but I'm sure you think a lot about the future still. What do you think it will mean to be human in 20 years or 30 years from now, based on everything that you see? And take us on a little journey, if you would.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember reading the book Earth by David Brin many years ago. Sure. And it's the rare example of the book too, that I didn't like it when I read it the first time, and someone convinced me to read it again, and I really liked it the second time I read it for whatever reason. But I think in the foreword to the book, he makes the point, like, writing a piece of fiction that takes place 5 years in the future is easy, and writing a book that takes place 100 years in the future is easy. Writing 30 years in the future is really hard, right? Because it's got to be recognizable,
right.
But it still has to have something in it that's sort of surprising, but you could sort of draw the line and see how you actually got there. Yeah. And it's been interesting for me following ride sharing. And as someone who's been an avid ride sharer, like, I've really, I've gotten a tremendous amount of use out of Lyft, and thinking about, how long does this last? Because there's particular aesthetics that people, like steampunk sort of things, where people show like the world with a lot of dirigibles. Right. Or you think about the Pony Express, and Pony Express feels like an era, like the era of the Pony Express. It was like 6 years, like it really didn't last very long, because then like the railroad comes and wipes it out. Right. Or you could look back and people could imagine, like, oh, did people have satellite phones for like 50 years? You're like, no, like people had satellite phones for like 10 years, right? And then the cell phones pretty much wiped them out. Right. And so when I try and think forward a little bit, I try and imagine, like, what are the things that are going to go somewhere or not go somewhere. And I like the idea, and now I got to build coronavirus into the whole thing, right? I lived for a year in Japan, and I remember when I first came back, and someone went to shake my hand, and there was this sort of brief moment of revulsion. I'd gotten so used to like bowing to people, it felt very strange to touch a stranger, and I'm wondering how much of that will stick in our culture. But from a what's your day-to-day experience like in 30 years? Maybe the relationship between task and location has really started to dissolve. And we're already seeing that, right?
Sure.
Like the idea of like I have to go to a store to buy something, the idea that I have to go to an office to work with people, like has been on a downward trend, and we're sort of through an acceleration of that right now. Um, and so does that mean that, I think some people felt like, oh, that means sort of that cities start to go away because there's a lot of downsides to city. People like to be close together. People like some
Mm-hmm.
density. They like the excitement. And there's some experiences that you have to be physically there.
Sure.
And it's funny, even I think about, the one of the retail streets near me, which used to be camera stores and things like that. And now it's all like personal gyms, because the only thing that can survive in those spaces is something that you have to be present for.
Yeah.
And so it became much more body oriented. And so there's still the restaurants, their bars, and their personal gyms. And that's sort of what you have. There have been some really innovative art installations I've seen that it's worth being there in person. When you look at the stuff that's coming out of Burning Man in terms of light installations and things,
Mm-hmm.
and that's really exciting. But I would say probably if I had to pick one thing, and not having spent a lot of time thinking about it, I would say that, yeah, maybe we start to have a lot more fluidity about task and location,
Mm-hmm.
even to the point of like the idea of like, oh, I'm sorry, task and location is, so something like a vacation changes. And so now I can be like, oh yeah, it's summertime. Like I'm going to go work out. I'm going to go to the Sierras and I'm going to keep working. I'm not on vacation, but I'm just going to change the
Mm-hmm.
environment I'm in. Does that change people's relationship to the home in the same way it's changing it to the car now? Where I'm like, yeah, a car is a utility. I get in it and I go somewhere. Or do people still have enough of a nesting instinct that they're like, no, I need my space, my stuff? And how much can you let that go and be like, yeah, I float. Airbnbs, lifts, like I got a laptop. When I get bored of being somewhere, I go somewhere else, and I have continuity in my relationships. I have continuity in my career and things, and I can do that without being bound to a place. And I think there will be a portion of the population for which that's going to become true.
Mm. Very nice. Very nice.
It wasn't very health oriented. Do I need to make it more health
No,
oriented?
no, no, no.
Okay.
No, not at all. That's fine. One other question. Influencers, important mentors in your career so far. Obviously, you've had the chance to work with quite a broad range of folks. You mentioned Dr. Collins at NIH. Obviously, your history with your great great uncle George. Other people that have um, kept Chris Lunt on this particular path, guided you. If it weren't for them, you'd be off doing law or something else entirely. Anyone you want to shout out to specifically on those fronts?
Maybe could I give a couple influential books? Would
Sure,
that be one way to
sure,
do it?
sure.
Yeah. So I'll say
Authors are fine.
At Home in the Universe by Stuart Kaufman,
Okay.
which is a book about emergence.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea of
Love
like,
Kaufman.
how do complex things come into being? Does it take a designer? Can those sort of evolve naturally? I think
Yeah.
that was a book that was very profound for me. Along the same lines, Critical Mass by Philip Ball, I think, was another
Okay.
good one that touches on a lot of those same topics. I have to say and to spread it around a little more broadly, I don't know that I'm in love with the Silicon Valley of 2020,
Hmm.
but
Okay.
the Silicon Valley of the 1990s was really amazing place to be.
Sure. Sure.
And that the set of people who are really dedicated to not making money as much as a set of ideals, right? I think about something like Wired magazine or something, right, which had just an attitude and an idea about this, and it's funny because it goes back to the same guys that were part of the Whole Earth catalog, and you look at a lot of those early internet pioneers, and they were hippies, and there's still some hippies out there doing this work, and yeah, and it's inspiring to see people that. And this is a quick aside. So I have two kids, and when my kids went to a parent participation school, so the parents had to do some classroom time, and I went
Okay.
through classroom training before I could do that.
Neat.
And they asked me when we're doing that, "What is your mission for your child's education?" And I was like, "Wow, man, I don't know. Like I hadn't really thought about that before, and like that's worth knowing. Like that's worth sort of having some idea." And I wrote it down. It took a couple tries before I got it, and once I got it. it helped me understand what were the important lessons you had to teach them. And one of those lessons, I think, was philosophy. Philosophy, because
Sure.
you could let someone else hand you their value system, but you probably shouldn't do that. Like,
That's true.
you have, in the end, you get to decide where you find value in the world and in purpose and meaning in your life. And you can do that by handing the question to someone else and say, like, I'm going to belong to this religion, and they're going to tell me where meaning and value is. But if you're going to do that yourself, you're going to need a set of skills, because even the things I would tell my kids, the philosophies that I use to guide my own life, won't work, because they're going to be exposed to novel situations that my stuff doesn't handle. And as much as my parents could, like, and being a parent, right? And how do I manage screen time with my kids? I'm like, this is new. Like, I can't go, well, according to the ancients, like, this is how you treat your kids. Like, and so I need to give that gift to my children as well. Like, I need to give you rational thought and a way to build your own value system.
Because it's really been a pleasure having you here today, talking about yourself, obviously the program that you're involved in leading, and just really wishing you the best at it, and when everything that comes next, and all of these new steps and processes and so forth that are going to be opening up, and it's going to be really interesting to see the as you talked about emergence before, so the emergence of something like this, which we've never seen. I mean, 1 million patients, huge data sets, but what you're doing has the ability to, as it's called, impact all of us, and it's so extremely important. And really taking the time out of your schedule to come on the show, it's really been an honor. And for everybody that's watching on the YouTube channel, or going to be listening on any of the podcast networks, you've been listening to Chris Lunt, Chief Technology Officer for the National Institutes of Health All of Us Research Program, doing really amazing things to accelerate health and medical breakthroughs, prevention, treatment, and care for all of us. Chris, I wanted to thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for everything you're doing for humanity. But then, as we say, also, thank you for moving the human story forward. And in essence, taking us on that step to redefine what it means to be human. It's really been a great time.
Thank you, Ira.